Okay, so like we said, guys, it's going to be just AP only stuff here. Reminder that you've got your cell anatomy lab report due on Friday. Okay, so make sure you've got that done on time. All right, so we don't lose any late marks or anything like that. Make sure you go over the podcast while you're doing that and look at your microscopy lab. Make sure you don't make any of the same mistakes if you made any, okay, on that lab. All right, so that you get a really good mark on this one. All right, so today what we're looking at, a couple of things. We're actually going to probably get through 3 different lessons today. Reproduction and variation is the first part. Okay, so we'll be looking at comparing sexual versus asexual reproduction, benefits, drawbacks of both. Okay, looking at that from a genetics standpoint, okay, in terms of producing variation. All right, what do we mean by variation? If there was no variation, how would we all look? The same, right? Okay. Variation means that everyone has a unique combination of genes. All right. That's why they can use DNA to identify people. Okay, during DNA testing, there is a 1 in about 6 billion chance, all right, or so of having the exact same DNA as somebody else. Okay, and that includes identical twins. You can actually genetically tell identical twins apart. There are even the slightest little variations. Well, they say, oh, like 1 in 6 billion, but technically there's really no way anyone could have exactly the same combination as you, unless they were your clone. Okay, which is also part of the reason why human cloning has been banned, right? Is that you could create a clone of yourself, right, and then fake your own death by murdering your clone, which is murder or suicide. We don't know which on that one yet. Okay, all right. Okay, key points. Okay, we need to be able to distinguish. We need to be able to distinguish between sexual and asexual reproduction. Hopefully you guys know the difference already, but we'll go over it. Okay, identify examples of each type of reproduction. Okay, understand how variation is produced in each type. Okay, and evaluate the benefits and drawbacks of each type in terms of adaptation to the environment and production of variation. Obviously, variation is important because the environment changes, okay, and that creates a certain amount of adaptability, not necessarily for each individual organism, but for the species in general. All right, if, for example, because I mean, there's always all this stuff about, you know, this doomsday plague that could come around and wipe out, you know, human civilization, whatever. But there's enough human variation that there's a possibility that at least some members of the species would be immune. Okay, in that case, those who are immune would survive, and the species would carry on. Now, if you're not one of the people who's immune, that may not be much comfort to you. All right, but in the end, the variation is only looking to save the species, not necessarily the individual. Okay, everybody follow me there? Yeah, right. And this is something that was sort of discovered very early on when people started doing studies with microbiology. Okay, you'll do this if you take genetics at university in one of your earliest genetics courses. You'll expose bacteria, E. coli bacteria, to ultraviolet light. Okay, and then you'll put them on a petri dish containing penicillin. All right, some of them will still grow because you have mutated them by exposing them to UV light to be immune to penicillin. All right, which means they're penicillin resistant, and now they survive, they reproduce, and you've got a petri dish full of penicillin resistant E. coli bacteria. Did they all survive? No. There were probably millions of bacteria that you put on that petri dish that died because they weren't resistant to penicillin, and the penicillin killed them. All right, but there was at least one that was, and that one reproduced and flourished. Everybody follow? All right, so that's kind of the purpose of variation, is to hopefully have enough differences out there that at least some members of the species would be able to adapt to a change in the environment. All right, so first type of reproduction we'll look at, simplest, asexual reproduction. Okay, asexual reproduction is essentially splitting in half. All right, is that going to produce very much variation? No. Okay, you're copying your DNA and making an exact duplicate of it. Now, that may not sound all that good, but if you survived long enough to reproduce, were your genes well adapted for your environment? Yeah, they were. So Why not? Let's make more of them then. All right? If you were well adapted to the environment, your offspring are going to be well adapted to the environment because they're exactly the same as you. Okay? That's what happens with asexual reproduction. And that's fine until something comes along and wipes you all out. All right, but for the most part, you don't see catastrophic changes like that. All right, so strictly speaking, like begets like, which means essentially you're always making a copy of what you had before. Okay, so in asexual reproduction, a single individual is the sole parent and passes copies of all its genes onto its offspring. So single-celled organisms reproduce asexually by what's called mitosis. All right, so kind of an important word to know there. Mitosis is a fancy way of saying cell division. Okay. In mitosis, your DNA is copied, and then each cell gets its own copy of that genome. Okay, genome is the word we use to describe all the genes an organism possesses. Okay, so the offspring are exact copies of the parent, and that would apply probably 99% of the time that they are exact copies of the parent. There are cases where during the copying process mistakes are made, whatever, and there are slight changes between the offspring and the parent, and that can produce additional variation within the species. Okay, but it doesn't happen very often, and unfortunately, most mutations are bad. Okay, most mutations end up causing some sort of defect that results in the organism dying, okay, or not being able to survive in the environment or whatever. Okay, there is a very, very small percentage of mutations that result in greater survivability, okay, but they're very, very slight. Okay, now, there are some multicellular organisms that are capable of reproducing asexually. There aren't very many, but there are some. Okay, the hydra, which is what's in this picture here, is an example of an organism that reproduces asexually through a process called budding. Okay, and it just makes a little bud, and it looks initially it just looks like a little bump. Okay, kind of like this on the side of the hydra, and then it eventually grows, and the cells start to specialize, and then it kind of falls off, and it plants itself, plants is a bad word, anchors itself, okay, nearby and survives on its own, and that hydra then has an exact duplicate, okay, hanging around nearby. All right, jellyfish can also do a similar thing. Okay, they're quite a simple organism. Okay, since the cells of the bud were derived through cell division, through mitosis, they are exactly the same as the parent. Okay, and again, that's about 99% of the time. There are occasions where a slight mistake gets made and there's a slight difference, but most of the time it's so minor you wouldn't notice. Okay, very rarely genetic differences caused by changes in the DNA, okay, cause small differences, like we said. Okay, so is it important to know what a mutation is? Would that be a key word? Okay, mutation is any change in your DNA, okay, or alteration to the DNA. Now, because of the way science fiction and comic books and all of that kind of stuff have portrayed mutations, we have an incorrect idea of how they happen. All right? Mutations happen during the production of offspring, either asexually or in the process of production of gametes, okay, in the process of your producing sperm or eggs. Okay? That's where mutations can occur. Those mutations are seen in the offspring. All right, the offspring will be different from the parent. You, as a fully grown organism, are not going to mutate. All right, if any of your cells have an error in them, they will either become cancerous or make a tumor, or they will simply die. Okay? They will not turn you green, give you the ability to shoot lasers from your eyes, okay, make you have bones that can heal right away and big claws that come out of your hands or anything like that. Okay? Mutations do not happen in a fully grown organism that cause a change to the whole organism. Your genome is already set, and it was set the day sperm met egg for you. You cannot, a mutation being exposed to gamma rays will not turn you into the Hulk. Okay? It's simply not going to happen because every one of your cells has the same DNA, and they're not going to change. No. Again, their DNA was set the day they were conceived. All Right? So all of their cells arose from that cell. If there was a mutation on that cell, the initial zygote, then yes, that offspring could have some differences from the parent. All right? But other than that, no. Once essentially you're born, even before that, the possibility of really changing your DNA is very, very slight. Okay. All right. Now, how many people have seen this happen? Right? You leave the potatoes in the pantry for too long, and then you reach in there one day and you think there's a giant spider in your pantry because they've got sprouts on them that are 2 feet long. Okay? Now, usually by that point, the potato's also kind of squishy. All right? But these are examples of asexual reproduction in the potato. How do you plant potatoes in the spring? Right. In the ground, okay? You buy seed potatoes, okay, and you cut them up, okay, into small parts, and you throw them in the hole in the ground, you bury them, and they will grow, okay, into a fully fledged potato plant through what's called vegetative propagation. Okay? Vegetative propagation means to take a group of cells or tissue from one organism and grow a new organism from it. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of organisms capable of doing that. Most of them are plants. Okay, these big palm plants over here that I have in this room, all right, all of these were grown through vegetative propagation. When I first got this plant in 2002, wow, I'm really old. Okay, there was one single stalk. Okay, so there had been like one stalk like this. All right. Since then, it gets too tall, okay, and then it can't support itself like this one's about to do, and it starts to fall over. So you cut it off, and you stick it back in the ground. Both pieces will grow. In fact, you could cut it into 3 or 4 pieces, okay, all the way along the trunk here. You could cut it into 3 or 4 pieces, put them all on the ground, they'll all grow. Okay, every single one of them. In fact, you can see on this one here. I've got to turn it here. Let's pick it up. Now, you can see right here that this one has been cut off. Okay, at the top, you see where it's white here at the top? Okay, that's where it was cut off. It's grown right from there, and there's another little bud coming off over here. Okay, all of these here were just stuck back in the ground. Okay, this one right beside it, same idea. It's growing from a spot where I cut it off. Okay, they'll all grow again. Bamboo will do that. Okay, lots of different kinds of plants, okay, are capable of doing that. Not all of them, obviously, but many of them you can grow through vegetative propagation. Okay. Question, Julia? To grow another plant from essentially tissue from an adult plant. Yeah. Okay, now, there does have to be a fair amount of, for the potato anyway, fuel available. Where does it get the fuel? Actually, it gets it from the potato itself. That's why you can't cut it too small. Okay? The potato is full of starch, which is plant fat. Right? And usually there's enough energy stored in starch in the potato itself to get the sprout going, at least long enough to get where? Where does the sprout need to get to if you put it in the ground? Right, until it can get a sprout out of the ground into the sunlight, and then it can carry out photosynthesis, and it just takes off from there. All right, if you've ever seen one of these, they start to get leaves on them even if they're still in the dark. They're just purple. All right, but if they get really crazy, they'll actually push doors open. Not that I've ever left one long enough to have that happen, but okay. All right, so that's vegetative propagation. Now, this can happen in very few animals. All right, there are very few animals where they can reproduce asexually. Starfish is one. All right, most of the animals that this can happen on are fairly simple. All right, so starfish, and this was discovered unfortunately too late for a lot of fishermen. They hate getting starfish in their nets because the skin of a starfish you've ever felt is really rough, and it can tangle nets really, really badly. So what they would do is they'd finally get them out of the net and they'd rip them in half and throw them back in the water, not realizing that they'd only doubled their problem. All right, if any part of the central disk of the star remains, it can grow a new starfish. Okay, and that's what you're seeing in this picture here. This was the one leg that was left from the original starfish, but there was enough of the central disc, okay, the central portion of the starfish, for it to start growing. All new legs, all new fish. Okay, worms can do the same thing. Earthworms. Okay, if you cut them in half, both ends will grow. All right. In fact, you can cut them into several sections. The only thing that won't grow is the very tip of the tail. Right? So they can sort of regrow or regenerate lost limbs, or in this case, regrow entirely new organisms from what was left. Okay. All right. Again, is that going to happen in nature very often? No, not really, because nothing really preys on a starfish either, right? Because there's not a lot of nutritional value to them, but okay, they are capable of doing it. All right. Again, these are also essentially clones of the original organism because all they have are cells from the original organism containing the original DNA. Okay. All right. Has anyone ever seen a starfish open up an oyster? It is really cool to watch, actually. Okay, they'll like they'll put their arms on both sides of the oyster and just start pulling. Now, what the oyster has to do is it has to close its shell, okay, really quickly, and that means that it can no longer bring in fresh water over its gills, so it can only hold it shut for so long. Okay, and if a starfish gets it partway open, the starfish turns its stomach inside out, inside the oyster. Okay. I've never been able to find one, okay, but I got shown one in my zoology course in university, okay? And once they pop it open, they just their stomach turns inside out into the oyster. They eat the oyster, suck it all back in. Okay. All right, other examples of asexual reproduction. Okay, the amoeba. Okay, this picture here is actually showing an amoeba that's just about done dividing. So you'd have one amoeba kind of right here, and the other amoeba down here. Right, so during cell division, they can split in half. Again, both amoebas are essentially the same. Mold, okay, mold is an asexual reproducing organism, but it can also reproduce sexually, okay, if spores from other molds, okay, can kind of be, what's the word I'm looking for here? Transferred. Okay. All right. So, but an asexual reproducing one means it produces spores that only have its own DNA, and then those spores go somewhere else and germinate, and then you've got a whole new mold growing somewhere else that's genetically identical. Okay. Bamboo is another example of vegetative propagation. All right. You can take a piece of bamboo and stick it in the ground, and it'll start growing again. Right. Which is especially useful because bamboo tends to grow in places where it gets broken off, okay, blown over in storms and things like that, and the pieces that are blown over can grow again. Okay, questions on that stuff? All right, now, sexual reproduction, okay? Obviously, there are some advantages, okay, to reproducing sexually because there's two sources of genetic material that way. All right, that means that there's a much greater chance of creating more variation, right, within the species if you reproduce that way. All right, so compared to asexual reproduction, it usually results in greater variation. Two parents give rise to offspring that have unique combinations of genes inherited from both parents. Okay, for example, half of your genes come from your mom, half come from your dad. Okay, and in contrast to a clone, okay, offspring of sexual reproduction vary genetically from their siblings as well. All right. Like, I mean, you can always tell when you look at, a brother and sister or two brothers or whatever, that they're related, right? That they're closely related, but they don't look exactly the same, right? They do share some traits. They do share some traits of their parents, but again, there's quite a bit of variation, especially in things that you can't see, like blood type, right? How many of you know your blood type? Yeah, it's not odd. Most people don't until they give blood or get sick or something. But okay, chances are that you and your siblings have different blood types. Okay, it's just a good chance of that happening. All right, so always use this example here. All right, so these are two couples and the 4 children produced by these two couples. Can you tell who belongs to who? Because it's not directly underneath. Okay, take a minute, have a look, see if you can pick out who belongs to who. See how long it's taken you? Does that mean that there's quite a bit of variation possible between two people? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the actual combinations here are that these two kids come from these two parents, or the other ones on the end come from these two parents. Okay. You're still looking at it going, I don't see it, but it's true. Okay. But it just means that there's a lot of variation possible, okay, when you have genes being essentially combined. All right. Now, the other thing to remember about genes is that some are dominant and some are recessive, which we'll talk about a bit later, and that also helps to create a lot of variation. Okay, so one way sexual reproduction generates variation is that you get these combinations, right? So in mom and dad, the process of making gametes involves a cell doubling its DNA, okay, and then splitting again without doubling the DNA, because we want to get down to having gametes only have one copy of each chromosome. All right? In your body, you have how many chromosomes? Or in every cell in your body, you have how many? 46. Okay, you got 23 from mom, you got 23 from dad. All right, but that means that their cells had to half their DNA in order to make their gametes. If you have a gamete swimming in with 46 chromosomes, something bad is going to happen. All right, because then the offspring will have 69 chromosomes. That wouldn't work. Okay, just not going to work well. All right, so what's that? No, if you had one come in and one had 23. Yeah. All right, so this is what essentially can happen. You get, let's say that this was mom over here, okay? Mom's cell doubled its DNA, then it split, and then it split again. All right, now, the reason for the color coding is this. The blue chromosomes came from your grandfather. The red ones came from your grandmother, because this is your mom's cells. Okay, everybody follow me there? All right. Same thing over here in dad. Okay, the red's chromosomes came from his mother, okay, your grandmother, and the blue ones came from his father, your grandfather. Now, when the cell starts to divide and make the gametes, it could just divide and have, let's say, and this is an egg here that has just chromosomes from grandma, okay, just chromosomes from grandma, just chromosomes from grandpa, just chromosomes from grandpa. Now, the likelihood of that is very, very slim, but this is greatly simplified. All right. The other thing that could happen is that during the splitting process, we could get cells that have one from dad, or one from grandma, one from grandpa, okay, and same thing there. Now, is that going to produce even there just some variation? Now, imagine you got 23 pairs of chromosomes doing that, right? And that's not all. Okay? There's other ways that variation will get produced, because chromosomes don't always remain perfectly intact like this during the production of gametes. Okay? Sometimes another thing will happen, okay, that can cause pieces of one chromosome to attach to the end of another one. Right? And then that creates a chromosome that's, let's say, half grandpa, half grandma, and so you get a ton of variation. Okay, we call that process crossing over. Okay, crossing over happens, okay, during meiosis, which is the process of making gametes, where you get a piece. These two chromosomes are the same chromosome. All right, so they're chromosome, let's say, 14 from both, from grandpa and grandma. Okay, while gametes are being made, the chromosomes get stuck together. Well, the cell can't leave them stuck together. They have to be pulled apart. So when they get pulled apart, they kind of switch parts. Okay? And a little bit of one gets stuck on the end of another, and so there's some switching, which means that by the time you get down to making either an egg or a sperm, what's left in there is one full chromosome from grandpa, one that's partly grandpa, partly grandma, and the same thing over here, all right, which is producing even more and more and more variation possible, okay, for your offspring. Okay, everybody follow me there? All right, that's why sometimes you look at a family and you're like, oh yeah, I can easily tell, this one, they're all very, very similar. You can certainly see the family resemblance, and there's one that's just it's not the milkman's child, okay, but they just don't look anything like the rest of the family. That's what happens when you get a lot of crossing over. Okay, you can see this in my family. If you look at every coder generations back, okay, at the same age, we all look pretty much the same with the exception of like hairstyles and stuff. Okay, we all look pretty much the same. My son, very much like me and my dad and my grandpa. Okay, but my second son, he's all his mother. Okay, looks entirely like the other side of the family. Just a matter of how much crossing over happened in the genes that were making him up. Okay, making sense? Okay. All right. Now, some organisms like to have it both ways. So they will reproduce sexually and asexually. And the paramecium, one of the ones that we looked at in the microscopy lab, will do this. Okay? Paramecia will conjugate, okay? Which means they'll kind of meld their membranes for a little while, and they have two nuclei inside. They have a macronucleus, which is kind of the main nucleus. It's bigger, okay, and it runs all the protein synthesis and all of that. And they have a micronucleus that gets produced, and it's small. It has only part of the genetic information in it. They'll exchange these little micronuclei, and then the micronuclei will go back to the big nucleus, the macronucleus, and that new DNA that they've received from the other paramecium will get written into theirs. Then they split in half. Right? And now you've produced two paramecium that are different from the parent. Okay? So it helps to increase the variation in an organism that would otherwise essentially have no chance of producing any. All right, so you do see that once in a while. Okay, plants can do the same thing. Fungus can do that. Okay, they'll have actually a sexual cycle to their life, and then they'll have the asexual reproductive part of their life. Okay, and that again also helps to produce some variation. Okay. All right. All right. Now, with plants have kind of a funny thing. They don't reproduce asexually, but they can reproduce without gametes from another plant. Okay, because they can do what? Anybody know? How does a plant reproduce? What has to happen? John? Right. Right. Okay. So in the process of pollination, right, pollen either comes to the flower from another flower or from itself. All right. Either way, it's still sexual reproduction because it's still sperm meeting egg, even if the sperm came from itself. Plants are hermaphroditic. They can fertilize themselves. Okay. So they actually have both sort of sexual organs. They have an ovary. That's, if you actually look at a flower, okay, inside of the flower, and I do a very bad job of drawing this, is kind of a vase shape. All right, and then out of the bottom of this vase are these kind of things here that the pollen sits on. Okay, these are called the anthers. Okay, and this is the stigma and the style. Right, the pollen can either arrive on the style from another plant, or it can fall onto the plant from itself. Either way, sperm will meet egg, and seeds will be produced. The seed will be encased in a fruit, and you've got the makings of a new plant. I hadn't heard of that. Usually in animals it doesn't happen. I suppose it's not impossible, but like I say, in animals it happens very rarely. In animals, you have to worry about having too much of the same genetic information too many times. Okay, we call that inbreeding. Right? If you have too much of the same gene pool, then the same recessive genes start showing up often, and then you start getting, issues with the same sort of genetic issues showing up all the time. Cleft palate, cleft, hair lip, things like that. All kinds of genetic ones that are obvious, and then obviously some internal ones that are less obvious. But yeah, if you don't get in fresh variation, okay, if you're breeding only within a small population, then you don't get enough influx of new stuff. There isn't enough variation, and it starts getting really bad in terms of the buildup of these genes showing up all the time. Okay. any purebred, yes. Okay, unless the breeder of that particular dog really knows what they're doing and they're bringing in stud dogs from somewhere else, then you have to yeah, if you're not doing that, then yes, you're always breeding within the same pool. You're breeding, brothers and sisters or cousins, and it's not. You're gonna end up with hip dysplasia and stuff like that happens in labs and German shepherds, and it happens in all purebreds if the breeder hasn't been careful. We had a Yorkshire that, it had an enlarged heart, its teeth rotted out, it had no lower jaw. Like, it was just so horribly inbred, right? That it just had all these genetic weaknesses about it. That said, it still lived to be 14 years old. But all right. So that's all we need on that one. Okay, we'll move on here to Mendel. Okay, so Mendel is generally viewed as the father of modern genetics. Okay, which is odd. Anyone know what his line of work was? Nope. He was not a dentist. He was a monk. Okay? An Augustinian monk. And he is the father of modern genetics. Okay, believe it or not. Mendel's job, in addition to being a monk, was he was in charge of taking care of the garden in the monastery, growing peas and food and whatever else for the rest of the monks in the monastery. What he noticed was that if he did the pollinating of the plants, okay, so he would take like a paintbrush and he would get pollen from one plant and fertilize another plant. He could control what kind of peas and what color of flowers and how big the peas would get, okay, by picking the parents, okay, of the next generation of peas. All right? And so he started keeping a record of, when I bred this one that had these traits with this one that had these traits, I got this many of this kind and this many of this kind. And what he noticed was ratios always showed up. All right? And that led him to believe that there were something called heritable characters, okay, is what he called it, that could be passed on from parent to offspring. Right? Now, we kind of all knew that because people's children look like them and stuff like that, but this was sort of the scientific proof that it was true, okay, as opposed to the anecdotal, well, my son looks like me, or my daughter looks like my wife, or whatever, right, and stuff like that. So this was more scientific. So we're going to learn vocabulary related to genetics, okay, and then we're going to look at how the traits are passed on, inherited, and expressed. Okay, having a gene is one thing, but it has to be expressed for you to know sort of what it's doing. All right, so Gregor Mendel was an Augustinian monk who used his observations of garden peas to formulate ideas about heritable characters, okay, passed on from one generation to another. Okay. All right, so he studied the garden pea for two reasons. Okay, peas were readily available from seed merchants in a wide variety of shapes and colors, and those shapes and colors were easy to identify. All right. Secondly, peas are capable of self-pollinating, which means he could just put a bunch of peas over by themselves and know that they would only pollinate with themselves. All right, which would allow him to produce purebred seeds. Okay, which then he could plant and use for crossing with other types. Okay, and they have a short lifespan. They reproduce quickly, right? Every season or even twice a year, he could get another crop of them. All right, so the structure of their flowers also made it easy to ensure that the fertilization process could be controlled. All right, and you can kind of do that with any flower. If you want to make sure it doesn't pollinate itself, you can simply cut the anthers off. All right, before they get tall enough for the pollen to fall down onto the stigma, you just cut the anthers off. Tiger lilies are one of the best flowers to look at if you're wanting to identify sort of the parts of the flower, because everything is quite large, okay, inside. All right, so the characters he looked at were the shapes of the ripened peas. Okay, either they were smooth or they were wrinkled. You've probably noticed this if you've ever looked closely at like peas that you take out of a bag. Okay, frozen peas. There's some wrinkled ones and there's some smooth ones. Okay, it's based on their genetics. Yellow or green seed interiors. Now, most of the time we don't have yellow ones. Okay, but there are some types of peas that would have yellow peas. Purple or white petals on the flowers. Okay, inflated or pinched pods. Okay? And you can see this if you ever grow peas in your garden, that some of them will have pods that are smooth, and others the pods will pinch in around the individual peas on the inside. All right? Again, it's not a sickness. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a genetic thing. Okay? Then the other things, where the flowers occur on the plant is also genetically controlled. Right? They can be axial, which means they're essentially anywhere on the plant, or they can be terminal, which means they're only on the ends of the tendrils or stems. Okay? And the last thing, long or short stems. Okay? So essentially you could have normal or dwarf, okay, types of plants is what he called them. All right, so lots of different things that he could look at, and then he would cross plants that showed these things and see what their offspring would show. And that allowed him to determine which things were dominant and which things were recessive. All right? If he bred, for example, a tall plant with a short plant, and all the offspring were tall, what does that tell him about short plants? They're recessive. Okay? The gene for being short would have then been recessive. If he crossed yellow with green and all the offspring were green, okay, then he knew that the yellow was a recessive trait. Now, the weird thing is when he took the offspring of those crosses. So he took a plant that he knew was purebred, okay, let's say green seed, and he crossed it with a plant he knew was purebred yellow seed. All the offspring were green. Now he bred the offspring. They all have green seeds, but the offspring of that generation would produce 3 out of every 4 offspring. 3 would have green seeds, and 1 would have yellow seeds, even though the parents both had green seeds. All right, and so that is what led him to question, where did those yellow ones come from? I bred ones that only had green seeds, but the generation before, he used a plant that had yellow seeds. So the genes for yellow seeds were passed down. Okay? The plants that in that next generation that were all green, some of them had to still be carrying a gene for yellow seeds. Okay? And that was sort of Mendel's discovery and his contribution to all of this. All right, so parents of a cross are often referred to as the P generation, the parental generation, or the first one, okay, or primary generation. Okay, so the P generation, he bred purple flowers with white flowers. Okay, now he knew that these plants were purebred purple because it didn't matter what he did; they always produced purple, purple, purple. All right, these ones here were purebred white. They have to be. The only way you can get a white flower is to have all white genes. Okay, because it's recessive. All right, he crossed them. He gets all the offspring have purple flowers. All right, but here's the thing. Some of them still have to be carrying which genes? White genes, because this plant can only give the gene for white, and this plant can only give the gene for purple. Purple shows up. Purple's dominant, but they're all carrying the white gene. All right, then he breeds these flowers with themselves. Okay, these peas with themselves, and the next generation he gets 3 purple and 1 white. Okay, does that mean they all have the same genes? Nope. Okay, one of these flowers is probably purebred purple. Okay, this one's purebred white. These two are probably what? Right, they're just like these ones. They carry 1 purple and 1 white. They just look purple because purple is dominant. Okay, but they're still carrying the white gene. All right. Okay, so this is what we're looking at from a more sort of genetic example here. Now I'm skipping over some of the terminology here. All right. First off, gene. Okay, a gene is anything that can be passed on. Okay, anything that represents a heritable character is a gene. Okay. There's always at least 2 forms of each gene. Okay? Those forms are called alleles. Okay? Okay? So any form of a gene is an allele. So yellow peas is an allele, green peas is an allele. All right. More terminology here. Homozygote. Okay? If you are a homozygote, you only have 1 copy of the gene. So both of your, I shouldn't say 1 copy of the gene. You have 2 copies, but they're the same. All right? You're only carrying, let's say, the gene for purple flowers. All right? Then you are a homozygote. If you are a white flowered plant, you are a homozygote only carrying the gene for white flowers. Both copies of that gene that you have are white. Okay, if you're homozygous purple, you have both copies purple. So that's what we're looking at up here. Okay, this flower here, this particular pea plant, is homozygous capital P, capital P. All right, capital P means purple. All right, this plant here is small p, small p. It's homozygous white. You guys with me? I haven't lost anybody here yet? Okay, so what happens is when we breed these two plants, they'll create the following genes. Okay, the purple plant can only produce purple genes. The white plant can only produce white genes. Now, when this one and this one meet, what do I get? Big P, little p. Okay, when this one and this one meet, big P, little p. This one and this one, big P, little p. Big P, little p. All of these are going to be what color? Purple, because they all have the dominant form of the gene, which is purple. But they are all heterozygous, because they have one copy of the gene that's purple and one copy of the gene for white. Does that make sense? Okay. So that was his first experiment, where he bred the purple flowers with the white flowers. Now he takes these, the offspring, and he breeds them with themselves. Okay, so he makes this cross. All right, these two come together, we get big P, big P. That plant will be purple. Okay, when these two come together, we get big P, little p. That plant will be purple. Okay, these two together, big P, little p. That plant is purple. And then little p, that plant is white. All right, is that 3 to 1? Yep, it's 3 to 1 for the expressed gene. All right, but it's 1 to 2 to 1 if we're talking about the genes themselves. There's one homozygote, two heterozygotes, and one homozygote white. Okay. All right. So these are called a Punnett square, by the way. Okay. You probably won't use them until you get into Bio 30 or something like that, but that's how we determine what the possible combinations are. All right. And that's the tool that Mendel used in figuring out why he kept getting a 3 to 1 ratio in the second generation every time he did this experiment. Okay, so heterozygotes. Okay, heterozygotes have one copy of each gene. Okay, yeah, I think that covers gene, allele, homozygote, heterozygote. Yeah. All right. Here's the other two words you're going to need to know. When we express a gene, the thing we can see is called the phenotype. All right. So the expressed gene, what it shows, is called the phenotype. Would blue be better? Yeah. Okay. Phenotype is what we see on the outside. All right. I've got type A negative blood. That's my phenotype. Okay. The thing you can't see is the combination of alleles. That's the genotype. Okay. So those two things are genotypes, as is big P, little p. Those are the genotypes. The phenotype, okay, is the color of the flower. Okay, the thing we can see on the outside. Okay. So, because of dominance and recessiveness, an organism's appearance doesn't always reveal its genetic expression. Okay, that's this phenotype-genotype thing. Okay, so we distinguish between an organism's appearance, its phenotype, okay, and its genetic makeup, its genotype. Okay, so an organism's appearance is its phenotype, its genetic makeup is its genotype. Okay, these are the genotypes here: big P, big P, big P, little p. All right, and then obviously they give us different phenotypes down below. All right, everybody with me there? All right, so different versions of genes, okay, like we said, those are called alleles, are what account for the variations in the inherited characteristics, okay? So the gene for flower color exists in only two versions, purple and white, okay? So that would be located somewhere on a chromosome, and this is what they look for, okay, when they're doing what's called a southern blot, okay, which is what the thing you see in CSI all the time, where they line up the stripes and you can kind of see the patterns. You guys know what I'm talking about? Okay, that's what they're looking for. They're essentially pairing up certain alleles. Right? So if the sample they have and the sample they took from you match perfectly, okay, the only chance is that that was you. The unknown sample was you. All right? Whereas if you share, let's say, a quarter of the markers with the sample they have, then they know that you're not the person they're looking for, but that you are related to them. Okay, and that they are probably your immediate sibling, right? Because you would share 1/4 of your genetic material with them, roughly, right? What if the sample shows that you share half of the markers? Now they're looking for your parents. Okay, does that make sense? Right, so these are the things they can tell. That's why using genetics is such a valuable tool in criminology now. Right? It tells them a lot. Not just, we can certainly say without a doubt that you're the killer, versus, well, you're not it, but you're related. So we got to start looking for somebody, okay, in your family. All right. So the location anyway of the white versus purple gene is this in the same place on both mom and dad's chromosomes. Okay, so for each gene, an organism inherits two alleles. We are what we call diploid. Okay, diploid means that you have two copies of everything. Right? The word diploid is spelled like this. Diploid. Okay, not diploid. Okay, diploid. And it means like diploid or diploidy. Okay, it just means you have two copies of all of your genetic material. Right? If you have only one copy of the genetic material, you're haploid. We can't be. All right, but your gametes are haploid. They have only one copy of all the DNA. Okay, so in every cell in your body, okay, the gene that we would be looking at would be expressed or would be in two places. Right? And that's pretty valuable, really, when you think about it. Right? Always having two copies. Right? This is why you see color blindness in men far more than you see it in women. Right? The gene for color blindness is on the X chromosome. Right? The sex chromosomes are X and Y. Right? They're the ones that determine your gender. If you are XY, you are male. If you are XX, you are female. All right? Now, if you are male, you only get one copy of the X chromosome, which means you only get one copy of the gene for color blindness. So, if you got the gene for color blindness on your single X chromosome, you're colorblind. But if you're female and one of your X chromosomes has the gene for color blindness, but the one you got from mom has the gene for normal vision, you have normal vision. All right? Which is why for men it's far more common to be colorblind, because we have far less opportunity to have a canceling, in fact, we have no opportunity to have a canceling gene. We only have one copy of that chromosome. No, they can be if they have it on both, but it's really, really rare. It's exceptionally rare. And when they do, it's usually not as bad. You're right. I mean, you don't see it expressed nearly as badly in women, okay? But they can still have it, right? But true red-green color blindness happens in males often. In fact, Mr. Van Erf, okay, is colorblind. You know if he gets out of the house in the morning before his wife sees him. Okay. Yeah, he didn't know Yoda was green. Okay. We saw him come in one day. It was a couple of years ago now. He came in and his wife was away somewhere, and we're like, "What are you doing, Jerry?" He came in, he had like a purple shirt and red pants. Like, you know, I'm just kidding. He didn't actually wear a purple shirt and red pants. He has his closet organized so he doesn't do that. You know, we've asked him that lots of times, and for him, he's just like, I see it the way I see it. He can't really explain it to us because it's not something he knows how to, you know, it's just the way he sees things. That's why, though, stoplights are arranged in a certain way. It's why you never see a stoplight with green at the top. If you're red-green colorblind, that would be kind of dangerous, right? Mr. Van Erve just knows that when the light at the top is on, he should stop because that light is red. Okay? And the light on the bottom is green. Or they always go from left to right if they're oriented horizontally, right? Red is always on the left, green is always on the right. Okay? So he just knows. All right? You guys with me on that? It's also why the advanced green usually, if like the turning signal, the advanced green, you know, the arrow flashes, but when it turns yellow, it stays solid. Right? All of these have to take into account that some people can't tell the difference in the colors. So there always has to be this. We don't notice it if we're not colorblind. So, oh, it's yellow now. Okay, we better slow down or speed up or whatever. Okay, but you gotta. It has to take into account that that can happen. All right. Most people don't even know that they're colorblind until they take their driver's test. All right. One of the things you have to do when you get your driver's license initially is you have to look at these little circles, and they're made up of dots of different colors. And the different colors will show numbers on the inside. So if they've got a green background with a red number in the middle, and if you're not red-green colorblind, you can see the number, no problem. Mr. Van Erve has never seen a number in any of the color blindness tests because he just can't. Okay, he can't see the difference between any of the colors, and that's just a bunch of dots. Okay, for you or I, we pick it out real easy. All right. Now, if your two alleles are different, one is dominant, okay, and fully expressed in organisms in appearance, the other is recessive and has no noticeable effect on the organism's appearance, that's the simplest way. Okay? There are some things that have partial dominance, some things that have co-dominance. Blood type is an example. All right. O, believe it or not, the most common blood type, is actually the recessive form of blood types. Okay? A is dominant to O. All right? B is dominant to O. A and B are co-dominant. If you have one A and one B allele, you are AB. All right? The Rh factor, because often people say I'm A negative or B positive or whatever. Okay, the Rh factor, positive is dominant over negative. Yet, O negative is the most common blood type, even though it's recessive. Okay, believe it or not, it's just that much more common. Okay, out there. All right. So according to this part of the hypothesis, Mendel's F1 plants, okay, had to be homozygous for their alleles. Otherwise, there would have been white flowers in the second generation. All right. If he had bred, let's say, the white flower with a purple flower, but that purple flower was heterozygous, so it had one big P and one little p, he would have got half and half. All right. Half of his offspring would have been purple, half would have been white. But both purples would have been heterozygous or homozygous? Heterozygous. Remember, he bred a white flower, and the white flower can only give which gene? White. Okay, so when we do the Punnett square here, okay, of breeding the white flower with a heterozygote, okay, every single one of those plants gets a little p. All right, half of them will get a big P from the heterozygote. All right, so this one got a big P, it's purple. This one got a big P, it's purple. But they all have a little p from the white flowered plant. Okay, so he would have got half and half. That's how he could tell. Okay, he would breed plants until he only got what he was looking for, and then he knew that those plants were homozygous for that trait, and he would use those to start his next trial. Okay. All right. So, two alleles for each character separate when gametes are being formed. All right. So when let's say sperm are being formed, if you're type AB blood, okay, the sperm will only have either a B or an A. It won't carry both. Everybody with me on that one? right? And that's how you can kind of figure out if people in your family know their blood type. You can figure out what yours is going to be, right? Or what your parents must have been, right? For example, I know that I'm AO. I'm blood type A, but I know that my genotype is AO. All right, A is dominant to O. How do I know that I have an O gene? From my parents. But here's the thing. One of my parents is type B, and one of my parents is type A. Right, and now I look at what my sister is. Okay, my sister's type B. Okay, which means that my parents have to both be homozygous or heterozygous for their blood types. Heterozygous. Okay, my dad is BO, okay, and my mother is AO. Right? They have to be. It's the only way that I could have ended up as A, and my sister ended up as as B. All right, so let's have a look at this. Kind of build a tree here is what we do. All right. So I am AO, okay, and my sister is. Oh, sorry, my sister is O. What am I saying? My sister is O. The only way you can be O is to have two O's. Agreed? Because it's recessive. All right, so that means that, okay, the parents here, okay, had to be, okay, I know my mother's type A, and I know my dad's type B. That's the only way that they could have one child that's O and one child that's A. Okay, and you can then figure out what their parents were. Okay, the only way to get a child that's O and B, okay, is to have one parent who is B. Okay, you got to have one that's B, all right, and one that's either AO or OO, okay, or that's BO. You guys following me here? It kind of breaks down a little bit, unless you know all the other siblings. Okay, if I know what all my aunts and uncles' blood types are, I can figure out what, most likely, what my grandparents' blood types were, and so on and so on. Okay, now you take that another level down. Okay, my wife is type O. What blood type can my children have? O and A. Okay. Those are the only blood types possible for my children, O and A. Okay, and that's exactly what they are. Okay, my son Reed is type A, and my son Luke is type O. All right, that used to be how they determined before before DNA testing. That used to be how they would determine the parents or the father of a child. Okay, obviously determining the mother is easy, but determining the father of a child could sometimes prove difficult. Right, and that's how they would do it. They would look at the child's blood type and the father's blood type. Now, is that 100% accurate? Nope, it's not. Okay, it's likely, but there's always then the chance in something like that that the two possible fathers may have had the same blood types. Okay. Yeah. All right. Hey, some other examples of heritable traits in humans. Widow's peak. Okay, you can either have a straight hairline or you can have a widow's peak. All right. Now, looking around here, okay, I'm seeing more straight than widow's peak, which is usually the case. Okay. So, we'll start out here with the grandparents of these two young ladies down here. All right. We've got one that is big W, little w, and one that's little w, little w. Okay. Their children. Okay, and circles are females, squares are males, okay, in a diagram like this. All right, they got 50-50 because one was a heterozygote and one was a homozygote, so it's 50-50 in here. All right, so these ones here are the widow's peak. No, sorry, are the straight hairline. Okay, so white is the straight hairline, okay, and purple is the widow's peak. Now, when the two parents, okay, got together, they both had what? Widow's peak or straight? They both were widow's peak, but they had a child who was straight hairline and a child that was widow's peak. All right. Now, this child here could be big W or big W, little w, but we won't know which until until she has children. Okay, and then we'll know whether she was homozygous or heterozygous. Okay, making sense? Right. Okay, same with ears. Ears come in two types: hanging earlobes or attached earlobes. Hanging earlobes are dominant to attached. All right, so if yours dangle like this, okay, that's the dominant form. If they attach, that is the recessive form. Neither one is better or worse. Okay, you don't start picking on people because they have attached earlobes. Okay, but the attached earlobes, okay, are the recessive form of that. Okay, you would have to be little f in order to have attached earlobes. All right, now, if you look up here, right, you got two homozygote, okay, parents, and they are giving rise again to 50-50. All right, anytime you have two homozygotes, you're going to have 50-50, okay, in their offspring. And then you've got one with hanging lobes and a homozygote for attached. Okay, just so happens that they also had 50-50 in their offspring. And then we had these two with hanging earlobes, okay, who had children, okay, two daughters, one that had attached, one that had hanging. Okay, and again, we won't know whether this person with the hanging earlobes is heterozygous or homozygous until they have children. Okay. All right. Questions on that stuff? There's usually questions on different traits that you can have. Right? Eye color is another one. Okay, but eye color is one of those ones that's got a lot of partial and co-dominant kind of stuff. That's how you can get like hazel eyes versus green or blue. Okay, what color is dominant? Brown. Okay, brown eye color is dominant to every other color. All right, nothing goes co-dominant with brown. Okay. Yes, the ability to roll your tongue is genetic. Okay, it's based on the orientation of the muscles in the tongue, and that is genetic. So if you can roll your tongue, what's that? The ability to roll your tongue is dominant to not being able to roll your tongue. Okay. Now a bunch of people, I can see people. Yeah. Okay. If you can roll your tongue, it's pretty rare actually to not be able to do it. Okay, so that's kind of like having a calico cat. Have you ever seen calico cats? They got patches of different color fur, right? And that has to do with incomplete separation of that particular allele. So when there was crossing over that occurred, the point of breakage was in the middle of that gene. All right, and so you got one copy of the gene where you had color for blue and one that was kind of either one, and then so you get one different color eye. It's pretty rare. Okay. Gene dilution. I don't think I've ever heard that term before. It must mean the same thing as hybrid vigor, something like that. Okay. In some cases, being a heterozygote is better than being homozygote for either one of the other two. Sometimes being a heterozygote gives you increased resistance to certain things. Certain blood types have different resistances to blood-borne diseases and things like that. So being type A or being Rh positive versus Rh negative, things like that, being a heterozygote gives you increased resistances to some things. I've never heard the term gene dilution before, but it might just mean that you brought in some recessive genes and they're starting to show up somewhere, maybe. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, so it's kind of like co-dominance, yeah. So the heterozygotes are showing a little bit of both. Yeah. Oh yeah, albinism. Okay, so if you've ever seen an albino person, okay, that is genetic and it's highly recessive. It is incredibly rare because usually there are other problems involved with being albino that result in actually not being born. Okay, so it's what's called like spontaneous abortion is the term. It's kind of a miscarriage is really what happens. So yeah, you don't see it very often, but it is genetic. Yeah. Can't everybody do that? Can't roll their R's. It's probably the same thing to do with rolling your tongue then. Hmm. I didn't know that. I'd never heard that one before. Ability to roll the R's. Eh. Okay, so listen up here, guys. We're probably not going to get to this part here, so we'll go over this tomorrow. But okay, a couple of things here. Because you guys are going to be taking, actually in this unit, this is really the only unit where you've got a lot of extra material. All right, so there's going to be a few days like today where I'm going to go over 2 or 3 things and just jam it in. Okay, so be aware that in this unit we're going to fall behind the other classes. Okay, and that's not because just because we're taking more stuff than they are, but that's going to mean we all have the same amount of days to finish the course. That's going to mean a couple of times you're going to talk to your friends in regular science 10. They're going to go, oh yeah, we got a day to work on this thing. Don't get sour with me. You're not going to get those days sometimes because we got to make them up somewhere. All right, so just be aware this is the unit where that's going to hit you a little more. Okay.